It's difficult to represent history on the big screen in a way that pleases everyone. You only have 1.5 to 3.5 hours to tell a complete story, and considering historic events can take days, weeks, months, years, or longer to play out, you're always going to tick off someone. With the difficulties hereby acknowledged, some films really just get it wrong. They don't even try to represent history. It could be for any number of reasons. Perhaps they're more concerned with the story as opposed to events, which is fair enough. Still, in this video, I want to take a look at the movies that neglect history that could have been easy to get right, but brushed it aside in favor of a more dramatic tale. Sometimes they invented drama that didn't exist, other times they just invented history wholesale without any regard to what actually happened. Some of the movies are good, some not, but all of them pissed off some historian somewhere. I, unlike many people, actually enjoy Michael Bay movies. Bad Boys, Bad Boys 2, Armageddon, The Rock, The Island, Pain and Gain, and several of the Transformers movies are eminently enjoyable. There's a reason that Bay is fairly respected by his peers. The only people that don't like him are critics and the movie-going audience, but what do they know? Sure, the King Arthur thing in The Last Knight was dumb as hell, but we also got Optimus riding Grimlock in Age of Extinction, so as far as I'm concerned, all is forgiven. Well, almost all. Bay took perhaps more creative license than was necessary for 2001's Pearl Harbor. While the movie made bank, it got a lot of criticism for historical inaccuracies. It's thought to be one of the most inaccurate military movies ever made, and for some, it fails as a movie as well. Lauren Sweet, a military historian, said that the movie got a few things right. For example, the Japanese did, in fact, quote, bomb Hawaii on Sunday morning, 7 December 1941. It does depict the aircraft carrier Akagi, the Japanese flagship, with her island on the port side. The film also captures the chaos the Japanese planes created during the first 10 minutes of the surprise attack, end quote. But beyond this, Sweet said that, quote, Pearl Harbor fails to provide even a reasonable facsimile of history, end quote. Going further, he said that, quote, Randall Wallace's original script showed virtually no awareness of actual history, end quote. The problems, it seemed, were innumerable. For example, it showed the Battle of Britain going on in 1941, even though it took place in 1940. It showed Roosevelt demanding a retaliatory strike against Japan from Admiral Chester Nimitz and General George Marshall. In reality, they advocated for the strike. PearlHarbor.org cataloged a number of other mistakes, including depicting the Arizona Memorial, even though it wasn't built until 1962, which could have been fixed with CGI, depicting unrealistic dogfights and maneuvers that planes at the time could not pull off, and using the wrong biplane model in the beginning. The movie also invented fictional characters in place of simply portraying real-life figures. This, on the whole, isn't as big of an issue for me as it is for others, at least in some contexts. Sometimes composite figures can help you tell a story that real-life figures can't. Jack and Rose weren't really on the Titanic, but the ship was essentially background to the story that James Cameron wanted to tell. However, when it comes to such an emotionally charged and studied event as Pearl Harbor, it's often a better idea to actually go with real figures. In the movie, Ben Affleck's character is supposed to be modeled on Kenneth M. Taylor, a pilot stationed there during the attacks. Taylor was one of a handful that got a plane in the air and managed to shoot down enemy aircraft. He served as a technical advisor on Tora Tora Tora, which was praised for its accuracy. Of Pearl Harbor, Taylor's son quoted his father as saying that the movie is, quote, a piece of trash, over-sensationalized and distorted, end quote. That seems to be the accepted opinion, historically speaking. Similar to how I enjoy a great many Michael Bay films, I enjoy a great many Roland Emmerich films. Emmerich almost instinctively knows how to make disasters seem magnificent. 1996's Independence Day, 2004's The Day After Tomorrow, 2009's 2012, and 2013's White House Down are all eminently enjoyable films, and I even have a soft spot for 1998's Godzilla. He also seems to have an understanding and appreciation for recent history. In what's like a counterpoint to Michael Bay's Pearl Harbor, Emmerich's 2019 film, Midway, though it got mixed reviews and bombed at the box office, did get praise for its historical accuracy. It was kind of like what happened with 1970's Tora Tora Tora, which also got mixed reviews but praised for its accuracy. According to Naval History and Heritage Command Director, Navy Rear Admiral Sam Cox, quote, despite some of the Hollywood aspects, this is still the most realistic movie about naval combat ever made. It does real credit to the courage and sacrifice of those who fought in the battle on both sides, end quote. That respect for modern history did not extend to prehistory, as was evident in Emmerich's 2008 critically disastrous but still fun movie, 10,000 BC. The movie depicts some things that just didn't happen. To be sure, this is a fantasy, so this is not but nitpicking. For example, slaves and woolly mammoths are being used to construct the pyramids in Egypt in the movie. Considering the first pyramids in Egypt were built around 2780 BCE, the movie was off by around 7,000 years. Social constructs, like an actual language, were also off by thousands of years. Even the first cities didn't start to come into being until around 7400 BCE. It also depicted mammoth hunting. That, I think, is less objectionable. Sure, by this time, the mammoth was on its last legs. Thanks to overhunting, as well as a shift in the climate, the mammoth had begun to go extinct, though pockets of them would actually survive on isolated islands as recently as 2000 BCE. That's pretty recent, historically speaking. There's also a scene where the protagonist, prior to helping a saber-tooth, asks it not to eat them. The saber-tooth kindly agrees and even returns the favor later by saving him. Though it's unknown whether the big cats could understand human speech or intention, it is, in my opinion, unlikely. It also showed domesticated horses, which didn't arrive until almost 8,000 years later. According to Dennis Stanford, then a curator of archaeology at the Smithsonian, quote, "There wasn't a scene that I saw that was anywhere near accurate," end quote. Ross McPhee, curator of mammalogy at the American Museum of Natural History, took the inaccuracies in stride, saying that he was happy that the time period was getting attention and that he and his colleagues were looking forward to answering questions about it. That, I think, is the right attitude to have when it comes to movies like this. Don't take it too seriously. Argo, directed by Ben Affleck, is enjoyable as a political thriller. The movie is about the exfiltration of a group of Americans by CIA operative Tony Mendez during the Iran hostage crisis. It was a joint rescue mission by the Canadian government and CIA to rescue 6 diplomats that managed to evade becoming hostages. The plan was to exfiltrate them under the guise of filming a scene of a fake sci-fi movie there. The movie certainly took some creative liberties with its depiction of the events. The one that probably elicited the most controversy, especially with our friends up north, was the minimization of Canadian involvement. Whereas the movies depict Canadian ambassador to Iran, Ken Taylor, as little more than a bit player, he was a lot more important to the entire enterprise. According to late President Jimmy Carter, quote, "I would say that 90% of the contributions to the ideas and the consummation of the plan was Canadian, and the movie gives almost full credit to the American CIA. And with that exception, the movie is very good," end quote. He went on to say that, quote, "The main hero, in my opinion, was Ken Taylor, who was the Canadian ambassador who orchestrated the entire process," end quote. Taylor was a good sport about it, recognizing that, by virtue of this being a movie, things had to be condensed and considered from a dramatic viewpoint. It also neglected the British and New Zealand embassies' roles with respect to the diplomats that needed to be exfiltrated. In the movie, it's noted that both embassies turned away the diplomats when they needed safe haven. That was not true. The British embassy hosted the diplomats for a while, but it was decided to move them to the Canadian embassy because it was safer. Both the British and New Zealand embassies would do what they could to assist in the operation, including driving the diplomats to the airport. Sir John Graham, who was British ambassador to Iran, said, quote, "My immediate reaction on hearing about this was one of outrage. I have since simmered down, but I'm still very distressed that the filmmakers should have got it so wrong. My concern is that the inaccurate account should not enter the mythology of the events in Tehran in November of 1979, end quote. Affleck commented on his decision, saying, quote, "I struggled with this long and hard, because it casts Britain and New Zealand in a way that is not totally fair. But I was setting up a situation where you needed to get the sense that these 6 people had nowhere else to go. It does not mean to diminish anyone," end quote. For his mistakes, Affleck was censured by the New Zealand House of Representatives in 2013. The dramatic ending was also made up for the sake of the drama. The diplomats were not almost discovered, and there was no car chase sequence where a bunch of guards tried to stop the plane from taking off. In fact, according to Mark Lyjak, one of the diplomats that was rescued, quote, "Fortunately for us, there were very few revolutionary guards in the area. It is why we turned up for a flight at 5:30 in the morning. Even they weren't zealous enough to be there that early. The truth is, the immigration officers barely looked at us and we were processed out in the regular way. We got on the flight to Zurich and then we were taken to the US ambassador's residence in Bern. It was that straightforward," end quote. U-571 is a submarine film from 2000 that was directed by Jonathan Mostow and starred Matthew McConaughey, Bill Paxton, Harvey Keitel, and others. As a movie, it got alright reviews and made some money at the box office, though it got a lot of flack for its plot. The movie, similar to Argo, places Americans front and center in a story where others were the heroes. With Argo, it was the Canadians' contributions that were minimized. With the U-571, it was the British sailors' contributions that were obviated. The movie portrays the capture of a German U-boat, the titular U-571, in 1942 in order to steal the Enigma machine that's on board. The Enigma was a cipher that was used in World War II to protect German messages from being read if they were intercepted, and breaking it allowed the Allies a wealth of insight into what was going on behind enemy lines. This could have been an interesting historical movie, but instead of taking the historical route, the movie just made up a bunch of events that didn't happen. Whereas the movie shows an American crew acquiring the Enigma, the British had already captured one in May 1941 before the US entered the war, and years before the US captured their own in 1944 aboard U-505. A Labour MP, Brian Jenkins, said that the movie was a, quote, affront to the memories of the British sailors who lost their lives on this action, end quote. UK Prime Minister at the time, Tony Blair, said that he agreed entirely with that sentiment. There is a note in the credits that mentions the actual captures of the Enigma, though for most it hardly suffices. David Ayer, who co-wrote the screenplay, would go on to say that he regretted Americanizing the events. In his words, quote, "It was a distortion, a mercenary decision to create this parallel history in order to drive the movie for an American audience," end quote. He mentioned that his grandparents were officers during World War II, and that he, personally, would be offended if someone distorted their achievements. He promised that he wouldn't do it again. He seemed to take it to heart, as one of the movies he would later direct, 2014's Fury, which highlights tank warfare in April of 1945, received decent praise and plaudits for its accuracy, though, as is always the case, there are aspects that are more fiction than not. And there's also the whole fact that there was an actual U-571. That one was sunk near Ireland and was not rated by Americans for its Enigma. It's only right that The Greatest Showman, a musical about the life of legendary showman P.T. Barnum, leaves out a lot of history or makes things up. It's not too dissimilar from what Barnum himself did, after all. That, to an extent, is show business, the practice of weaving a yarn meant to interest people. The real-life P.T. Barnum began his career exhibiting a slave, Joyce Heth, in 1835. He hailed her as the 161-year-old nurse of George Washington, something that didn't even have a kernel of truth to it. It's worth reading what one poster depicting her said, quote, "Joyce Heth is unquestionably the most astonishing and interesting curiosity in the world. She was the slave of Augustine Washington, the father of General Washington, and was the first person who put clothes on the unconscious infant, who, in after days, led our historic fathers on to glory, to victory, and freedom. To use her own language when speaking of the illustrious father of the country, she raised him. Joyce Heth was born in the year 1674 and has, consequently, now arrived at the astonishing age of 161 years," end quote. After she died, instead of laying her to rest, Barnum arranged a public autopsy and charged admission, while a surgeon, Dr. David L. Rogers, performed the procedure in front of 1,500 people. When Rogers said that Barnum lied about her age, Barnum tried to cover it up, saying that Heth was actually alive and touring in Europe. It wasn't until later that he admitted to the hoax. The Barnum that's shown in the movie is depicted as caring about the people that he showed off. That, evidently, could not be further from the truth. Barnum was known for hiring people to quote-unquote recruit people for his circus. Some could be willingly recruited because they had nowhere else to go and no one to support them. Others, meanwhile, would essentially be trafficked. In one instance, Robert Cunningham, a quote-unquote recruiter for Barnum, convinced or trafficked 17 Aboriginals from Australia. One of them was Tambo, who was one of Barnum's Aboriginal cannibal boomerang throwers. Several of these Aboriginals died within a year, unable to acclimatize to the climate. Similar to Joyce Heth, Barnum would parade their remains around as a sideshow. Tambo's remains weren't returned to his native Palm Island until 1994. Some stories, like that of William Henry Johnson, are just as sad. Johnson is thought to have suffered from microcephaly, which resulted in a tapered head. In order to make money, his parents essentially leased him out to the circus, who then leased him out to P.T. Barnum, who portrayed him as the result of bestiality. Johnson, like several others, was a staple in Barnum's human zoos. The movie has a message of acceptance irrespective of one's physical traits. That's an admirable message, to be sure. P.T. Barnum, however, is perhaps not the best conduit for it. Ron Howard's 2001 film, A Beautiful Mind, was a critical and commercial success, winning Howard Best Director and Best Picture, as well as many other awards. It was a biopic of John Nash, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1994 for his work on game theory. Nash suffered from schizophrenia. The movie got that part right. But Nash suffered from auditory hallucinations. The film showed him suffering from auditory and visual hallucinations. Film, of course, is an audio-visual medium. It relies on both sight and sound to tell a story. Giving it a visual touch certainly makes it a more dramatic film, but it also adds an entirely new dimension to Nash's life that just didn't exist. That being said, could the movie have worked without the visual hallucinations? I'm not so sure. I think it's possible to create a thrilling movie that focuses more on sound, but the visual component is, I think, a necessity, and it serves to enhance the issues that Nash faced on a daily basis, even though it's not quite accurate. Ken Davis, then chairman of psychiatry at Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York, praised the movie, saying that, quote, Crowe does a brilliant job of portraying the mannerisms and some of the behaviors of a schizophrenic, the best I have ever seen on the screen, end quote. Still, he also notes that, quote, the notion that willpower can really overcome schizophrenia is ludicrous, end quote. The movie also left out some parts of Nash's life entirely. There's the fact that he had abandoned Eleanor Agnes Dyer after she told him that he had gotten her pregnant, and that he wasn't a part of one of his son's lives until later on and had to be forced to pay child support. When he and his son reunited, it was apparently short-lived. The young boy would eventually say that, quote, having a mentally ill father was rather disturbing, end quote. It also left out an interesting event where Nash was once arrested for indecent exposure in what was apparently a sting operation targeting gay men. He would lose his top secret security clearance and was fired from the Iran Corporation, which he consulted for. The real John Nash was an interesting, complicated figure, and while the movie captures one of the most salient traits, it certainly didn't capture the totality of the man. Still, that doesn't mean that it's not a good movie. 300, directed by Zack Snyder, is an iconic film at this point. The film was a tremendous box office success, and it showcased aspects of Snyder and his cinematographer Larry Fong's penchants. Slow motion, speed ramping, hyper-stylization, and plenty of violence. It's safe to say that 300 is one of the most iconic films of the 2000s and one of those movies that entered the culture. Rotten Tomatoes captured the essence of the movie very well. Quote, a simple-minded but visually exciting experience full of blood, violence, and ready-made movie quotes, end quote. The movie is, of course, not without its historical inaccuracies, which is to be expected. Adapted from Frank Miller's 300, the movie is a fantastical retelling of the Battle of Thermopylae. In it, King Leonidas of Sparta leads 300 Spartans to hold off the advance of the Persians under Xerxes' 300,000-strong army. The movie puts the entire focus on the 300 Spartans, even though the combined Greek forces was in the many thousands. It was certainly much smaller than the Persian army, so the David versus Goliath of it all is still accurate. There's also a scene when the Persian emissary arrives where Leonidas takes a jab at the Athenians for being boy lovers. It's doubtful that that would have happened considering the Spartans had their own system of institutionalized pederasty. Later, when the 300 are about to embark, a council of elders, a representation of the Gerousia, confronts Leonidas about going to war even though he was told not to. This is pretty much the opposite of what happened. While the movie shows Leonidas disobeying the council and leading men to war, in reality he was ordered to. This is more an injection of the personal politics of Zack Snyder and Frank Miller, both staunch individualists who are deeply skeptical of government as a whole. The council, as well as the oracle, are institutions that try to impose limits on the individual Leonidas, but for the purpose of the movie, Leonidas disobeys them and marches. During the march, the movie also entirely neglects the existence of the helots, essentially slaves or servants that would have accompanied the Spartans to battle. While Herodotus' claims of 7 helots to a Spartan soldier is likely exaggerated, it's not unlikely that there would have been as many of them as there were soldiers. Historians also took issue with the effeminate interpretation of Xerxes, though this is something that Snyder owned up to. In his words, quote, "What's more scary to a 20-year-old boy than a giant god king who wants to have his way with you?" End quote. Frank Miller himself readily admitted to the inaccuracies. In his words, quote, "The inaccuracies, almost all of them, are intentional. I took those chest plates and leather skirts off them for a reason. I wanted these guys to move and I wanted them to look good. I knocked their helmets off a fair amount, partly so you can recognize who the characters are." End quote. He wanted the comic and the movie to excite people, and then they could go off and learn the real history by themselves. Snyder, on the other hand, was a bit more over the place. At one time he said, quote, "The events are 90% accurate. It's just in the visualization that it's crazy. I've shown this movie to world-class historians who have said it's amazing. They can't believe it's as accurate as it is," end quote. But at other times he said that it was a fantasy film and more opera than documentary. Miller would also say that he had a point of view and he wanted to share it. To get that point of view across, he had to fudge history a little. In his words, quote, "I didn't want to render Sparta in overly accurate terms because ultimately I do want you to root for the Spartans. I couldn't show them being quite as cruel as they were. I made them as cruel as I thought a modern audience could stand," end quote. So I guess here it really boils down to how much you want the creator's personal opinions entwined with the story itself. A lot of these movies have two things in common. One, they got important events wildly wrong, and two, many of them are a really fun watch. When watching a historical movie, while it's important to separate fact from fiction, it's also important to recognize that what you're seeing is an incredibly compressed version of events that play out over long periods of time. If you go to a movie expecting historical accuracy, I would say that you're looking for a bad time. Unless you've lived through certain events, you're never really going to get a good picture of what exactly happened. The most that a movie or TV show can do is try to get across one version of how dramatically things might have played out. These kinds of movies should stir up conversation and plenty of write-ups of what they got wrong so that people have a better understanding of what happened. That said, when a movie gets as popular as 300 did, it takes on a life of its own. It sort of subsumes the real history and establishes a new one. Sure, some try to correct the record, but it's often a futile attempt. It's the power and the danger of movies. But they should most certainly keep being made. I want more movies like Argo and 300 because they're incredibly fun and entertaining. Respect history, certainly, but there's no need to fear dramatizing it. Just make sure that if you do right by the people involved in making that history.